Wisconsin Rapids, this 5 p.m., Monday, January 15th, 2018, in the first floor conference room. Alderperson Terry Dolan. Alderman Stephen Coth.
Zach Brulink, Mayor.
Joe Zerflu, Alderperson.
Joe Terry, Public Works Director.
Adam Tagan, Community Development Director.
Sue Shell, City Attorney.
Shane Blazer.
Ben Kubiak, Alderperson.
Tom Riom, Alderman.
Greg Hepp, Alderperson.
Todd Furkey, Alderman.
Tim Schwecky, Civitech Consulting.
Charlie Handy, Civitech Consulting.
Shane Burkhart, Commission Member.
Scott Keller, the Alderman.
Slippery out there.
Sorry, guys. You know me, I like to be right on time. Item number 1, update on the zoning ordinance rewrite project with consultant Civitech. George.
Okay. Zoning stuff. We got a presentation up here for you. So just a little bit of, this is the outline of what we're going to speak on till about 9:30 tonight.
You got my orders.
So the team that's been working on this so far, obviously, all of the work days at this point have been with the City Planning Commission. Adam and Joe, your city staff, have been very heavily involved in this, and then Tim and myself and others with Civitech Consulting, and John Macy, our attorney, to help us and protect us from ourselves every day. We've been working on this for a good 2 years. So our role as your consultants is really to listen and to put down on paper the ideas that are coming from those work sessions, to learn from you. This is your city. Facilitate that open dialogue, make sure we get good public input, those type of things. So where are we today? The current zoning code is a legacy zoning code. That's the polite way of saying that it's old. A lot of revisions, and not a surprise, because many municipalities have it that way, but we really feel that this drafting is going to, bring you up to a great place with your zoning code. Again, with a lot of help from your staff. So these are some of the planning initiatives that you've been working on that we need to make sure are incorporated into this document as a group, and updating the comprehensive plan along with it. So, obviously some of these things have happened during the process of drafting the zoning ordinance. Related initiatives that are in Wisconsin Rapids, the Bird City designation and the Soul Smart designation, and they have some effect on the zoning ordinance. So this is the timeline that we started with. The dark or the charcoal gray lines show you what we've completed. So scoping, initial drafting, committee review, and revisions. And then you start to see where we're going from here. From tonight's meeting, obviously there'll be additional revisions based on the policy debate that we'll have tonight. There'll be an open house for additional public participation, some additional revisions after that. There'll be a public hearing, potential revisions from that, and then your consideration of the adoption of this. So these are some of the things that we've done so far for public participation. The website is really the key, where we've gotten a lot of kind of iterative public participation. The stakeholder listening sessions, those were done very early on to try to start to get an idea of the personality of the community. They were very helpful. We had great participation. We had a public scoping session. After that, then we did the visual preference survey, which we'll talk a little bit about some of these. And then the Planning Commission workshops. So just 17 of those to date. So you can kind of pat your Planning Commission on the back, because they've been really working hard. Open house is to do, and the public hearing is to do. So the visual preference survey, we went through 100 slides, and they were +5 to -5. You can see on the right side the scores of different photos. -0.6 in the middle one. 3.8, that was almost the highest score that we received. So it gives us an idea that nothing is really impressive, but nothing is also really offensive. So what we took out of that visual preference survey was The appearance of the built environment matters a lot. Too much asphalt in parking lots can be bad from visual, but also other reasons, things like that. Sidewalks are important. The overarching goals that we've tried to bring from that initial public input, that's a spelling error. We're not trying to make Adam easier. Make the code easier to use and enforce. Protect the community character, reduce the number of zoning districts, allow mixed uses where appropriate, things like that. Obviously, 8th Street was something that we heard time and again, so that's part of this whole process is working with 8th Street. And then increase the number of housing options. That's maybe something that's more trendy, that the demographics of today is really having an effect on that. And so in that public input, we heard that, and then we keep hearing that as we keep working towards this. So how do we house today's consumers? Residents are getting a little bit older, housing size is getting smaller, the middle class is shrinking, housing costs are increasingly a barrier. And the size of the units aren't just getting smaller, they're also getting bigger. The medium-sized units are getting less important as they were. So we're seeing the small and the large, really. Character of the neighborhood. Again, walkable, we hear that. Sidewalks and walkable is what we've heard time and again. So here's an article that we have about some of the possibilities of increasing those choices for housing. And we can talk a little bit about how we've tried to do that in the drafting of this zoning ordinance. So the basic principles of writing this code, write it simply and clearly. It's really good to have our legal staff on board to help us make sure that the drafting is understandable, that it matches with what legal review is reviewing across the country, so it's common. Divide the code into logical parts. Include legislative findings and purpose statements. That helps to protect us in the long run. It helps the public to understand what's going on. Keep each section short. Eliminate inconsistencies and duplication. That's very common in a lot of codes. Is over the years you do amendments and you get these inconsistencies and duplications that come into it. So it's our job to really try to get rid of those out of the code. Craft the code to allow subsequent amendments so that when you do make amendments in the future, they don't get to be a problem like they were with inconsistencies and duplication. Keep the code simple but effective. This is a list of limitations on local control. So these are things that the state has adopted as state standards, just so you know that we can't change those in your local zoning ordinance. And you probably know most of those from discussions that you've had in the past with the Plan Commission and at the council of things that you can't do, that you can't have an effect on. And then the next slide goes into the federal limitations. So if you go back to the last one, can I go back? Just scroll it. We're probably not going to get a significant amount of forestry operations and livestock operations inside the municipality, but there are other things, especially the solar energy systems and wind energy systems where you have that program going on here. Residential, specific residential types. So, and then there's some federal limitations on local control, places of worship, manufactured housing, and telecommunications. So we have to deal with those in the ordinance also.
So does that kind of make sense about the state limitations? Basically, the state is saying that municipalities have to allow certain kind of land uses, or they can't regulate them, or it's very narrowly construed in terms of what you can and can't do. Some of these things are just built in, and that's the way the state is kind of going. Increasingly, that you see a lot of industries going to the state legislature and having, their, issue taken care of to allow them to do what they want to do throughout the entire state. So, there's also other, limitations that just recently went through the state legislature. And it deals not with the land use per se, but a group of land uses called conditional uses. Okay? So there is this new state, I think it was Act 62 or whatever, but basically said that municipalities have to have a really, really, really good reason for denying a conditional use. Okay? So that is something that is just brand new. You have to have a preponderance of evidence that, for your reasoning to either approve it or to impose conditions of approval. So that's just something that's making it more difficult on the local jurisdictions. It's kind of pulling back the authority that you did have to allow some discretion. And now the state legislature is saying you don't have much discretion at all when it comes to conditional uses. Okay, so the landscape is always shifting and changing, and that's kind of the most recent trend, is to pull back your authority. Okay, and we'll get into this a little bit later perhaps, but essentially what that means is when we're talking about, and the planning commission is talking about what land uses should be allowed in what district, and whether it's a permitted use or a conditional use. If there's a potential land use that is currently shown as being a conditional use, you might want to rethink that to say, well, if we really don't have much discretion, should that land use be a conditional use in the first place within that zoning district? So that state change at the state level is going to have consequences down the road, because essentially some municipalities might say, that use was a conditional use, but we're pulling it back, which reduces the number of land uses that are allowed throughout the jurisdiction, because they just don't want to deal with the potential of a bad, application in the wrong location. So, anyways, just a lot of things happening at the state level that are kind of filtering down into the zoning. Each of you have a digital copy, and we've got some hard copies of the most current draft of the zoning code. It's dated January 3rd, 2018. Okay? Obviously, there's a lot to go through if you're so inclined, but I think it's fair to say that the Planning Commission over those 17 meetings has gone through that document. They've looked at various drafts, and we've been going back and forth with revisions. But essentially what we have is, several hundred pages of zoning, and we kind of organized it into 22 different articles. Your current municipal code has a chapter dealing with shoreline wetland overlay district and the shoreland overlay district and the floodplain regulations. We're pulling those into the zoning code, so that those development-related ordinances are part of an overall framework. Okay, and then we have a series of appendices as part of the document, and obviously, the intent is not to go through that entire document here or with you, but to kind of highlight some of the major changes, and those are kind of shown in the bold. So we want to talk about Article 5, 7, 8, 14, so on and so forth. Okay, so does that kind of make sense in terms of what we want to talk about? Are there any questions in terms of where we've been and what we're doing now?
We're moving through pretty fast, and we're kind of assuming you want us to, but feel free to jump in. Feel free to stop us and ask questions. Otherwise, we'll keep moving fast.
Okay, so the first kind of policy thing that we need to talk to you about relates to procedures. Okay, development applications are being submitted for different kinds of projects, and what we did with the Planning Commission was to talk about the steps in the process, who does what, who's involved, do they make a recommendation, do they make a decision? And a lot of these things, some of these procedures are kind of spelled out in state law. Others are procedures that are created internally as part of the zoning code. And what we did was to put this together in kind of a table format. And one of the things that we talked about with the Planning Commission about was one of the overarching goals was to make the zoning code simpler in terms of procedures so that developer can come in and get out quickly with a decision one way or the other. Okay? And one of the things that we want to talk to you about is perhaps in that vein to give the Planning Commission a little bit more review authority than what they have now. Okay? Just conceptually, for any number of procedures, the Planning Commission makes a recommendation. Okay? Then it goes to the Common Council, and then the Common Council votes on it. All right? And again, the thought was to give the Planning Commission a little bit more authority. You've got a great Plan Commission. They're very engaged. They're very knowledgeable, supported by staff. And to shorten that review period is to let them make the decision. Okay. So the case in point is conditional uses. Okay. By nature, a conditional use is a use that may or may not fit on that particular piece of property. So it's a case-by-case review. There's a public hearing. Developer comes forward. Notice is sent out to the neighbors. There's a public hearing notice. And then, again, there's a public hearing. Plan Commission hears, the proposal. They hear from the neighbors. And then currently, they make a recommendation to the Common Council. Okay? What was talked about was kind of, again, shortening that cycle so that developer gets an answer quicker, is to allow the Plan Commission to make the final decision. So you're not going to be seeing all the conditional uses on your agendas.
So that's really your first big policy discussion here is, do you want to see that change? Or do you want to see it continue the way it's going now? No matter what, we would recommend there to be some sort of change because of the state statute and because of the way a public hearing is held and then closed. That public hearing is the opportunity for both the applicant and the objectors to have a discussion, but they have that ability then to rebut any of that discussion. Once that public hearing is closed, any significant debate after that point is problematic from a legal standpoint. So if you continue with the current process, I would recommend that you minimize any significant debate after the public hearing is closed, or even consider having a joint public hearing where the Plan Commission and the Council meet. So that's a legal issue for you guys to think about and consider as you consider this policy debate.
So does that kind of make sense? It's our understanding that you get a recommendation from the Planning Commission, and it comes to Common Council, and you kind of rehash things. Okay? The point is that that's the purpose of the public hearing. Okay? So basically, you've got any number of options to kind of, I don't want to say do it the right way, but to do it the legal way perhaps. And that is to have the public hearing where everybody has the opportunity to speak. And then once the public hearing is closed, then it moves into the decision-making process. Whether it's done at the Planning Commission level or at the Common Council level. You can't reopen the debate at the Common Council on the merits of the proposal. Okay, because it's kind of like a new public hearing, and it's not set up that way. The solution to that, I don't want to say problem, but that situation is to pull it back to the Planning Commission so that as part of the public hearing, then they're getting all the information, and then they're making a decision on the record. Okay? The other way of doing it is to have the Common Council meet with the Planning Commission and have a joint public hearing. So that way, everybody's hearing the same thing. The Planning Commission can make, under that scenario, they can make that recommendation, but the Common Council will have heard all of the public comment and all the debate, and then you can make your own judgment. So those are the two different ways of doing it. So, any kind of reaction?
Well, I think my reaction, oh, excuse me, my reaction for it, I apologize, I'm another person. If we have it solely with the Plan Commission, then that basically takes some oversight away from us as the legislative body. I do like the suggestion of having a joint public hearing, because that allows us to be a part of it. It doesn't circumvent the legal process of lawsuits and whatever else. And that gives us an opportunity to be there when, and it's not like there's 55 of these a month. You know, it's infrequent enough where we can actually do that. So that would be I would vote against having the Plan Commission be the sole approver on this particular issue.
I just have a quick question too. So the Common Council would still be the body if someone wanted to appeal the decision?
That's the way it's currently drafted, yes.
Okay. And then how hard would it be for someone to file an appeal? Is it a relatively easy process, or would they have to kind of?
Yes, anybody could file an appeal, developer or neighbor.
Okay.
Okay, and quite honestly, we drafted it that way so that the planning commission could feel comfortable with their overall recommendation, but it's typically not done that way. Okay, to have that first level of appeal back to the Common Council. And it's kind of a unique twist on that process. Okay, but that's the way it's drafted right now.
So I guess to Thad's point, wouldn't it kind of be the same thing as rehashing it though if someone appeals it, or is that considered a separate?
Right.
Okay.
So basically, if there was an appeal, okay, the Common Council would get the meeting minutes from the meeting, all the information, and then just act on the information that was presented. You would be looking at the written record. You wouldn't be reopening up anything. You're just looking at all the facts relative to the case. And then you would vote one way or the other.
But I think that appeal process is more, and indictment is the wrong word, but I'm not finding the right word in my head, but it's more of an indictment of the process that the Plan Commission went through than it is, oh, we think this is fine, it should be allowed. So an appeal is really, somebody's filing an appeal because they're concerned with how they were treated or how the process went through the Plan Commission. And so, it could get really politically messy if it's, oh, we think this land use is okay. No, that's not what the appeal is about. The appeal is about, did the Plan Commission do the things they were supposed to do?
So that is a pretty significant change then.
It is, and it's a policy question that we wrestled with the Planning Commission about, or with. There was obviously pros and cons, but the intent was to kind of, again, shorten that development cycle so that developer would get an answer sooner rather than later. So it's kind of a, yeah.
Should have had a quick trip. Yeah, okay, I like Thad's idea, but yeah, I mean, we do rehash a lot of things, and kind of, I think I've had a discussion with the mayor several times, we kind of let public hearings come into the council meeting after we've already had the public hearing. We let people come up and talk again and rehash it. And I do think we ought to streamline it a little bit. I like your idea.
So by streamlining it, the decision really has to be made here, whether it's by the planning commission or by the full council.
Yeah, we could
here
have
at
the-
the,
yeah.
at the planning meeting,
Yeah,
right?
we could still have the, kinda like we got here right now, but.
Well, at a public hearing, joint one, now if the planning commission takes action, obviously we'd be more of just, almost like just a resident coming in wanting to express concerns, because we're obviously not voting members of that commission.
Yeah, yeah.
If you do a joint public hearing though, then it's for both of you.
Then you could have a.
Right, then
Right.
the debate is for both of you. The plan commission would then make a recommendation to the council. The council would take that recommendation during that meeting and make a decision.
Okay, then I misunderstood that.
The council would. The council would take.
If you did a joint process, yes.
And just to clarify, you know, conceivably with one public hearing, then you would get the recommendation from the plan commission, and the common council could take action that same meeting, or they could defer their decision to a later date, for whatever reason.
But we wouldn't have that second.
You wouldn't,
Hearing.
right, basically when the public hearing is done, it's done. You can't really accept anybody, you know, providing any input or, you know, anything like that.
Well, if you have that type of public hearing, they're getting their input to all the parties, right? So-
Right, in a single public hearing, we're
Yeah.
talking, yeah, and I think that's, the dynamic or the dance we wanna clean up, because there's just so many, especially the messier ones, the neighborhood issues. The rooming house, I think, is the most recent one where we went through a really long, public hearing, and, you know, they always felt that they should then take their issues and concerns to the council meeting, and it's, you know, to relitigate it or to rehash it. I think that's our fear. And I think the planning commission, speaking for the planning commission, maybe is, we don't necessarily care what the ultimate decision has been made, but the current system isn't exactly ideal, and we'd like it cleaned up.
Mayor, that's one that's going through my mind. Would they have had enough? That would almost, I'm just wondering if that would have passed in the scenario that we're talking about now, though.
If the planning commission would have approved it, you're
If
saying?
we would have had the,
Or the,
if we had been looking at with the council and the planning commission together, you know, because it was kind of like a fail-safe system that the planning had it went to the council,
yeah,
went back and whatever, of the boarding house up on, along the river there.
Strawberry Lane, yeah.
So in that particular instance, that went without a recommendation, right? It was a 3-3.
Maybe, yeah, that may be
Yeah.
right.
Okay,
Maybe
so-
right.
Yeah, so-
and that's kind of how we got so excited there with our votes. But,
That's okay.
but, so I understand, if you're not interested in allowing the planning commission to have the authority on this, then I would say whenever there's a public hearing, if the council wants to maintain that authority, then they should be at that planning commission meeting. But I don't know how we're going to make that decision if, what happens when 4 council members show up instead of 8, you know, so,
It would just be like any other meeting. I mean, you have to have a quorum
okay.
to take any action.
But you're still talking about 2 separate votes, right? A vote from the
Yep.
planning commission and a vote from the council.
One public hearing, one meeting,
But it's all one.
2 bodies
Okay.
acting as independent
Yeah,
entities.
see, Joel's got.
Yeah, so I was just gonna mention that, you know, I think another thing that's important about having the council, if the council's gonna maintain that authority, to have the council make the decision promptly after the public hearing, because it is supposed to be a quasi-judicial decision. And so what you want to avoid, and Sue can help correct me if I'm wrong, you want to avoid having residents lobby you afterwards.
That's what happened.
You know, before the council meeting and try to convince you and provide more information. That the information is supposed to be presented at the public hearing and the decision made, you know.
Yeah, so that's why I really want to streamline it.
But, yeah, and also, why couldn't you just hold a planning public hearing at the council meeting then? Instead of at the planning commission meeting, hold a public hearing at the council?
I mean, in terms of scheduling the meeting,
Correct.
it doesn't matter, you know,
Yeah, that
where
is-
it happens, it would just be a joint public hearing.
Yeah, but yeah, so then, even like that, yeah.
Right.
That makes sense, because right now we're doing that, and then we're doing it in the planning, then
2 weeks
they're
later,
calling,
we're
everybody's calling, then we're
Well,
doing the
especially
same
if
thing
you're
in the
worried about
council
quorum.
meeting.
Right.
Yeah.
You know you got
Council.
quorum at
You
the
got
council.
forum at the council meeting.
So then you get the lobbying that happens before that public hearing happens. So
but
it gives you
that's
public
what we do
a
anyhow,
significant
right?
chance to.
And, you know,
Makes a lot of council meeting though.
It's gonna change the
we're
council.
kind of, you know, diving into the weeds a little bit.
you're trying to
And-
streamline the work, yeah.
Quite honestly, I mean, what you want to do when there's a public hearing, and this is my professional advice, when there's a public hearing, when it's dealing with a conditional use, okay? It's treated like a court case, right? Where where everybody has the same opportunity to hear what's being said. So if there's a conditional use and somebody calls you up and says, you know, I really like this or I really don't like it, say, you need to stop right now. Okay, you should be sharing your comment to everybody as part of the public hearing.
Yeah, that's,
Yeah, you know how easier said than.
I know, but essentially, a conditional use is considered a quasi-judicial process. It's like a judge. You're hearing evidence, you're hearing input, and if you're, you know, acting on something that nobody else knows about, okay, that's not fair. It's not fair to the property owners, it's not fair to the applicant. Everybody should be hearing the same thing.
I agree.
And I get it when people call you up and they say, I want to talk to you about this. Legally, that's problematic. Politically, it's, you know, what do you do? But anyways, you know, the recommended answer is, you know, thank you for your input, but please share that at the public hearing. It can be written, it can be oral, but, you know, that's where everybody needs to be, you know, party to the same information.
And that's part of, I mean, it's part of the document too of how do we deal with public input that's in there. So, you know, can they have somebody represent them at the public hearing? And, you know, again, we're diving into the weeds. The real issue here is from a policy debate, as the council, you're the ones obviously that have to adopt this zoning ordinance when it comes through. So it's really, we will adjust the drafting of it based on your recommendation on this subject. So if you would prefer to see this stay as approval by the council, we'll make that change.
I have two concerns. One is that we're gonna have public hearings that should be beyond 4 o'clock. It should be 5 or 6 o'clock, because if we're gonna have access to opinions, it should be later. But I know the zoning now, they meet at 4, but I think anything that deals with the public hearing should be at 5 or 6. The other thing that concerns me, and I know Adam addressed this, but we had an issue with regard to Riverview Hospital and some issues there, where people have been notified 100 feet away from the boundary of that area. 100 feet, that's a house, you know, around that area. But there's people in the neighborhood living 300 feet, 400 feet. And I understand you know, how far do you inform people? If we have a hearing, we ought to make sure the people who have a concern are at the hearing and that they didn't get notice of it or information. So I don't know, you can say we put it on our website, but people, some seniors or whatever may not look on a computer for that notice, and all of a sudden something's passed, and then we hear the ramifications that we didn't know about because a person didn't show up or people didn't show up and would inform us of those ramifications. So I'm a little confused on that part. If we're gonna do this, we need to make sure that people who really have a concern are notified to be there. I don't know how that's done, you know. It's just, I'm gonna throw that out as a issue, not necessarily, I don't have the solution.
It's a good point, only because the code as drafted identifies the ways in which people are notified of public meetings and public hearings. Currently, the standard is 100 feet from the subject property. The question is that enough?
And that's mirrored based on state law, I understand, right? That's the state law is no
Um,
less than.
Actually, there's nothing in state law.
There's silent?
Yep, and, you know, quite honestly, and, you know, I don't want to step on Adam's toes, but, you know, typically it's 300 feet. Whether that's the right number or not, but that's, you know, 100, 200, 300 feet,
So I had to go house to house and pass out flyers, just because I don't want anybody in that area telling me that they weren't informed, because I got
Right.
calls. My neighbor down the street got a letter, but I didn't, in one of those issues. And as a district alderman, I felt I needed to go house to house. Well, maybe that's my responsibility, if that's in my district. I don't know. I'm just to inform my immediate neighborhood. Contact some of my leaders in my neighborhood, just to inform them of it, not pro or con, and then they can come and voice their opinion. So.
Okay. I mean, as long as the issue's on the table, I mean, is 100 feet adequate? I mean, that was,
Well, 300 feet, not that much more.
3 times more.
Well, I know, how much more work is it for 300 feet? Because obviously you gotta do a property search, you gotta look for stamps, postage is gonna have a cost on there, envelopes is gonna have a cost, but is it that much more? Is that something, is that gonna vary your office if that gets changed to 300?
Engineering does the map and the list. We do the label, the mailing, the copying, the folding, and then the cost of the mailing comes out of our budget. So the biggest thing is probably gonna be the cost, because if Riverview, for example, even at just 100 feet, I believe it was around 35, 40 letters. If you change it to 300 feet, you're probably doubling or tripling that amount. So there is a real cost associated with it. Time-wise, there's additional time just because you have to get the letters out. You might be worried about the time, but.
And then the benefit of reaching out to more residents, maybe that cost is worth it for the benefit. So, yeah, I mean.
I don't know when the 100 feet was adopted. It was definitely prior to me. Every case I've ever seen in our files, the map has a 100-foot buffer around it. Why that was chosen back in the day, I mean, it's been decades.
Dinosaurs.
I mean, what do you guys,
Yeah.
100 feet then?
it's typically 300.
Yeah.
I mean, not to say it's right or wrong, but I mean, typically that's the number. So,
Joe?
Yeah, I think one thing that's important also to remember, whatever is deemed reasonable by the council, you know, I would suggest, I think your efforts are noble to notify folks, but I think there's a potential concern with that, and that someone in a different district might then expect that their alderperson should notify them as well. And as a representative of the city, I think we want to try to make sure that we're consistent in how we notify the public. And we're notifying them, you know, in accordance with our standards. So if we need to change the standards, I think that's a wise thing to do.
right. Perception is more important than reality. Right? You have one alder doing something, and then he votes a certain way only because those people showed up. It's just like, well, was this fair? One way or the other. I mean, it's always perception. So, and, you know, quite honestly, you know, litigation always happens, typically, in large part due to the process. Was the process fair for everybody? For developer, for property owners, for neighbors? Was it fair? And that's the easiest way to take something to court, is to say, Judge, the process wasn't fair. They were biased one way or the other, they didn't follow their procedures, they didn't give me my due process. Again, property owner or developer. So I mean, always be cognizant of the process, how it looks, how it operates, to be fair, so.
As a consulting firm, public participation is one of our specialties. So we do that a lot. And there's no silver bullet. If you go from 100 feet to 200 feet, there's going to be somebody at 205 feet that says, I didn't get a notice. You go to 300 feet, and you guys all know this. So, you know, there's no silver bullet here. Do what you think is right, do what you think is appropriate, and stick to it. Be consistent. That's what Tim is saying, is be consistent. And you know, you're always going to have somebody that's concerned about, you know, the notification. That you're going to have somebody that didn't get the letter that they were supposed to get, or it's always going to happen. And so as long as you're consistent and you deal with everybody the same, then when that person comes in, that's the argument that you make to them.
Mhm. Anybody else? Okay.
Is there any appetite to change 100 to something else?
I think there was a consensus, unless someone speaks against it. I would recommend going to 300. At least we answered that, let alone the first question.
Right.
Yeah.
The second question was the easiest, yes. But yes, I mean, is that,
I'm for it.
We're just doing consensus tonight.
I do whatever the council wants, and if you guys want 300 feet, I'll do 300 feet.
300?
I would say 300. There's always that 305, but 300 is a lot better than 100 feet to justify.
The roads aren't a barrier though, right? I mean, it goes beyond the road, whatever number you come up with.
typically it's a set distance from the property.
A radius, yeah, so there is no
As it crows left.
physical barriers. It's a radius from that property.
Right. Currently, we exclude right-of-way. I think
Right.
your question is, does that 300 feet excluding right-of-way, or does the 300 feet include the right-of-way?
Right. So if you're crossing A Street isn't there when you're talking about the east side
Right.
and west
That's
side.
how
Yeah.
we do it, correct.
So,
Okay.
So,
Okay, so circling back to the big question.
I think you started off with a big one.
What's that?
I said it's a good thing you started off with the big one, because the rest of these are probably easier.
Yes,
On the
yes.
conditional use.
Right. So I guess I'm, perhaps kind of summarizing a little bit, but I heard, some common support to have a joint public hearing. Because I think you recognize the difficulty you've had with the Common Council, continuing discussion after the fact.
Yeah.
So-
I think it will straighten out a lot of confusion in my mind, and calls.
Okay, and if you go that way, then it doesn't make sense, obviously, to have the planning commission making the decision, right?
Right.
You still want to have that control, so to speak, because you are elected, planning commission is not, by and large. So, does that kind of make sense? Joint public hearing, you kind of, planning commission makes a recommendation, common council decides, whether at that meeting or a subsequent meeting.
Is there a reason to have the planning commission? I mean, I think that was our discussion, is the planning commission just didn't feel like if the council wanted to make the ultimate decision, the planning commission didn't necessarily want to provide a preliminary recommendation. If I'm remembering the plan in the two or here, it's almost like
I think there's
It's
a legal
irrelevant for the-
obligation, though, the planning commission
Okay.
must hear, right?
is that the,
With regard to rezonings and amendments to your zoning code, yes. It's in state statute that the planning commission must provide a recommendation. Okay? With regard to conditional uses and other kinds of processes that aren't spelled out in state statutes, you can, bypass the planning commission if you wanted to. But then, common council would be looking at site plans and architectural plans and.
That's what we got the planning commission for.
Okay.
In my mind. I'm just one guy.
and that was I think the planning commission's read was,
Right.
the planning commission's read on this was that the planning commission would be that body and then the council would
Yeah.
provide that appeal process. So there is a check to the balance, so to speak, but, I mean, I am completely understanding your positions on this and,
And if we're doing it together, in some instances, right?
Right.
yeah.
Not all, but.
I just think the planning commission wouldn't want to be called into a discussion, a public hearing, if they didn't have to be, I guess, is the point.
Right.
If the council wants to retain that authority, don't waste the planning commission's time, I
Yeah.
think is probably the way to say it.
Okay?
So just to kind of keep everybody on task and on schedule here, we expected to spend most of our night on this sheet. These are larger policy debates, so this is not a bad thing that we're spending quite a bit of time. And this was the one issue that we felt we'd spend quite a bit of time on, so that's good also. So this sheet, we're on number 3, and it's really the highlighted areas that we're gonna kind of hit, but you can look it through the whole sheet if you want. And so then we'll just kind of keep moving down, all right? Any questions, any more questions on number 3?
So it's that for CUPs, it is a joint public hearing, it is a recommendation by planning, and then a decision by, right, okay.
Correct.
By council, if there's a quorum
Right.
of the council, right? Otherwise, it's gonna have to be shifted to the actual council meeting, I
Yeah.
would suspect. And
And I don't know that we'll get in the weeds as far as
Yeah.
Okay.
the scheduling of the meetings and stuff in the zoning ordinance. We'll let you kind of figure that out. Once you get the zoning ordinance approved, then, okay, we've got to figure out these little details, so.
Okay. Now, the other one that we want to talk about, at the planning commission level, and when we were talking about this, we went both ways with the conditional use. But I'm looking at number 5 and number 6, and some of these other ones. So essentially, the question is, does the Common Council want to be looking at site plan and plan of operations? Do they want to be looking at building elevations? Do they want to be looking at, some of the more minor kinds of things?
I think probably that new procedure's adequate as I'm reading it,
Yeah.
I think so too.
and that's kind of,
So we got,
Terry said, that's why we have
And that's kind of that's why you have a plan commission, right?
Yeah.
You've got subject matter experts who know engineering, they know site plans, and the Common Council, I think, might have bigger issues to deal with, right? That's just, okay,
So then, number 13, the termination of an existing conditional use, that's not a huge deal if it's voluntary termination, but if it's an involuntary termination, sometimes those can get pretty, they can get pretty public. So again, we drafted it where the Plan Commission would be the recommending body, and the council would be the deciding body on a termination of conditional use that is involuntary. Everybody understand what that is, an involuntary termination? Okay, great. So that pretty much matches with your policy decision of number 3.
Again, 14, 15, 16, the way it's currently drafted, these are new procedures in the zoning code, but as drafted, the planning commission would make the decision. Do you need any explanation on 14? Basically, somebody has a non-conforming use, they want to have some written record saying this is what the conditional use is, so that the property can be sold, or if there's an enforcement issue. So it's very, I don't want to say technical, but you won't have a lot of these. So again, the recommendation is that it would be done at the planning commission level. Same thing with number 15, somebody's got a non-conforming use. They're going to be converting it to another non-conforming use, but it's going to be of a lesser impact. So the situation is going to be getting better. 16, again, we're dealing with non-conforming situations. And again, the recommendation is that the planning commission would make the decision. The other proposed change is a code interpretation under your current code is done by the Board of Appeals. And, I'm not sure how often the Board of Appeals meets, but they may not be the best body to deal with the technical language within a zoning code. So the recommendation is that it would be done at the staff level, and then if somebody appealed it, it would go to the planning commission. Is that kind of, okay. So actually, we kind of went through all the, new procedures and the recommendations, changing conditional uses, and by and large, all the other ones are kind of as proposed. And this is not gonna be the last time you can think about this or act on it. It's just kind of giving your sense for the way the code will be presented to the public as part of the open house. Okay? Any other thoughts, comments about process? process is important.
Did you retain that, kind of that peculiar thing in our code which creates treats a conditional use like a rezoning and the majority, sort of majority for the objectors? It basically says that if there's certain objectives for a conditional use, it requires a 3/4 vote, which is kind of, not in the state statute.
Right.
And I don't know if that's something that you retain or not, or?
I don't believe so.
Okay,
It's just a majority vote of the
Okay.
Common Council.
all right.
Okay? Good. I mean, this is good direction for us. Any other comments, questions about that? Okay. Continuing on, Article 7 is intended to, include graphic representations of different kind of buildings, so that developer, property owner can look at this and find out what building type they're proposing, and then there are certain development standards that go along with it. So it's intended to be very graphic, so that when people come to the counter, this page, along with some other pages, can be copied and given to the person to say, these are the standards that apply to this kind of project. Okay?
It's also intended to be easily viewed online and hopefully easily interpreted, but not always.
The other part that is brand new is a section talking about cottage housing. Remember, as part of our presentation, is more housing options. People are looking to downsize. They could be by choice, or they just can't afford a large house, whatever. So this is treated pretty similar to a conditional use. There's a public hearing, developer comes in with plans, people are notified. But it's a really concentrated kind of development option. So you see relatively small housing footprints in an overall development scheme developed by a developer. And there must be at least 4 homes as part of the overall project, and not more than 12. The project is designed so that there's high requirements for overall design and shared amenities, and then there's shared parking. So this is a brand new something in the zoning code. So developer comes in with a proposal, and they are reviewed on a case-by-case basis.
Why do you have a limitation not more than 12?
It's one of the things that it's potentially one of the variables that you can change.
Oh, you can change that?
Oh yeah, I mean there's nothing. I wouldn't say nothing, but a lot of the things that are in the zoning code are basically, numbers that make sense for the jurisdiction.
Oh, it makes sense, but somebody wanted 13 or something.
And the reasoning behind that is because you want to have these fit into existing development patterns, as opposed to create a brand new development pattern in and of itself.
Yeah.
Okay. And the other thing too, obviously this is a brand new, opportunity, and as you get more experience with it, you might want to play with some of those numbers. But it's a good starting point for your first development proposals. Okay. Any questions about cottage housing? Downtown design. This is a brand new section of the zoning code. And on the zoning map, we will be identifying where the downtown design area is. And the regulations that will apply are focusing on building design in terms of mass and height and how the building relates to all the other buildings in the area. There are standards for off-street parking and signage and utilities. Because essentially what you have is a very desirable downtown area, and you want to make sure that whatever projects come in, they fit into that context. or, you know, it could be a brand-new building, it could be a renovation, it could be a tear down, but whatever, you know, is built, you know, needs to complement what you have, and that's the intent. So there are standards in the text, and as part of the process, then the Plan Commission would be administering this part of the project. Okay? Very similar, or it's part of the overall site plan process. Landscaping and buffer yards, again, coming back to the original scoping sessions that we had with the public and as part of the visual preference survey. We are proposing brand new landscaping and buffer yard requirements. So within a commercial, institutional, industrial project, you're going to see more landscaping within the parking lot. You're going to see landscaping along the street, and then landscaping around the buildings. Again, it was one of the things that we heard is there's just not enough landscaping to kind of soften the edges and make it look nice.
We used a couple of real-world examples of applications that you've recently received, and we went through their landscaping plans and went through these landscaping standards to see, you know, how they matched, and pretty close. I think if the standards are there, they're gonna meet them pretty easily. But, you know, some of them could be way off. So we went through a couple of those examples to see, and that helped us to identify these standards.
The Quick Trip was a recent example of one where, while none of it's been planted, I don't think because of the time of the year they opened, but there was a pretty extensive amount of landscaping that the neighborhood, the buffer, the planning commission wanted to see on that site plan, and it met. I think there might have been an area where maybe it didn't quite square up, but I've got an Adam
If
left me an
anything, the
example
buffer
of it
yard was
that's-
over or under, I don't remember exactly, but the site landscaping, street trees maybe were a little low, but that was because there were some existing street trees there.
and the expressway and things, so. Yeah.
I can see this for new development, but what about an existing property that's making a change? Can we enforce this, that they're making an adjustment to their driveway, they're making they're putting sidewalks, and it's an existing property? Can we expect them to put this in as part of it?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like get rid of that grandfather clause in some cases that might be unsightly.
Right. And that was one of the things that we kind of wrestled with the planning commission is basically when do some of these standards come into play? I mean, what's the trigger? Okay. So with regard to the, you know, landscaping within parking lots, if they're resurfacing, if they're kind of maintaining, no. But if they're expanding that parking lot, they're adding new surface, then they would have to provide landscaping with the standards for that area that's being added. You can't retroactively go back and say, now you have to, you know, tear out asphalt because you have to do more landscaping. If they're expanding the size of the building, okay, then the landscaping for the building requirements would apply, but only to that part of the building that's being added. You can't go back in, as much as it might be desirable, to retrofit, you know, and require more landscaping. So you're going to be seeing incremental improvements in landscaping as things happen.
I think one of the small tweaks we've made is to ask. I think, Adam, we've said, here's the new proposed code. Will you consider, you know, putting this into your design pattern or plan? I mean, that's the least we can do. But as opposed to not having the conversation, making sure, hearing that it's been a priority, you've heard it, and as you said in the public input sessions, that we can simply ask, and that may be enough to get some consideration for it.
Right. The problem, though, is if it's not written in the code, you can ask, and they can turn around and say, no.
Right.
So, I mean, you know, your staff has been very good, and you know, Quick Trip apparently was more than amenable to meet the community concerns. But, you know, there are some property owners, developers, whatever, that said, no, this is what your code calls for, this is what I'm doing, that's it. So having it embedded into the code is a good thing. Very similar buffer yards. So you've got, commercial butting up against residential. The issue is if one or the other is brand new, you want to have something of a separation. You want to have landscaping so that one does not impact the other. So depending on the project, depending on the different land uses, we've got 4 different levels of buffer yards. And a buffer yard is a width plus landscaping. So residential butting up against industrial is going to have a bigger buffer yard than if commercial is up against residential. Okay, so there's a picture of residential up against the bank. They've got nice buffer yard, landscaping, screening, and we've built in flexibility so that developer can choose based on the property and the size of the amenities that they have, how wide of a buffer yard that they want to put in, and how many landscaping plants have to be added. So there is some direction, but there internally is built-in flexibility. Okay, so that's why you see, standard A, 1, 2, 3, 4, different widths, different amounts of landscaping. Standard B, 1, 2, 3, 4, again, different widths. But progressively, it gets more when you're going from A to D. Okay? And this is something that is going to be handled at the Plan Commission level as part of the landscaping and site plan review. So the Common Council won't have to worry about this in detail. Outdoor lighting, this is a brand new section. Basically 3 or 4 pages of the zoning code is devoted to this, and the issues that we're looking at is the type of lighting, whether the lighting is downcast or if it's kind of spreading out, the amount of lighting, and light trespass, lighting from commercial overspilling onto residential, and then light reduction when the business is not open. So those are the issues that are addressed as part of this article.
I do have a question. I'm trying to remember, did we talk about the color of lighting at all?
Some codes do that, and I'm not sure if the current code, the proposed code does that.
I don't believe so. Because I've attended some training, and as light gets whiter,
Yep.
as that number increases, especially above 4,500 K, the design of the lighting becomes much more critical. That light trespass becomes much more obvious. That the yellower the light, the more kind of forgivable that trespass, because it's not as noticeable. And I don't know if that's something that we really want to address here or not, but I thought I'd just mention it.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that can be included. And quite honestly, I refer to it as yellow light, white light. And the direction that a lot of communities are going is they are requiring the white light. Only because it's easier on the eye, and actually the color rendering of what you see with the white light is much better than with a yellow light. When you pull into the gas station, white light, right? And in the picture on the lower left-hand side, you see the yellow light. I mean, it's kind of hard on the eyes. So yes, I mean, basically there are values that you can incorporate into the lighting standards to say that if you're residential, institutional, commercial, you have to have a color value of X. If you're industrial, then it can be more the yellow light. So.
Yeah, everything in that chapter of the zoning code is based on lumens and foot candles. It's not based on color. So I mean, if you want to change that, now would be the time.
Or it could be something that's added sometime later. Basically just, get your footing with the, the standards as drafted, and then add it later. Or maybe just say, no, we're not going to have time later. Let's just do it now. So it's one of those policy questions.
thinking out loud, so my neighbor's got a light, according to this, that shines onto my property, actual event. And I gotta figure out the lumens and everything, to figure out if he can do that or not, or do we have an angle, or do we have in the code? I don't see any of that.
Most of the standards apply to commercial.
So nothing for,
I mean, I'd have to actually open it up, but there are some minimal standards for residential. Okay? And it's basically on the size of the light bulb, so to speak, in terms of lumens, whether it can be, shielded or unshielded. If it's a simple yard light that turns on, that might be unshielded. But everything else, theoretically should be shielded if it's residential.
Is it 9 feet from the property line? It's probably less than 27 feet in the air, right? So it has to be 9 feet from the property line?
sure it is.
If it's 9 feet, then
That's only
according to this.
A lot of those are.
No, guy next to him. I'll call my elder person today.
But I think there are still foot candle regulations. I'm assuming one of the things that will likely have to be purchased for the department is a meter that can measure foot candles. And if it's something that we've got a concern on, a lot of times what you have to do is actually go out there and measure, hold the device up, it'll tell you what that trespass is. If that exceeds, then they have to shield it by the code. To basically redirect the light down versus projecting it up.
Yeah, because I mean, that's a spotlight that,
Right. My guess is it probably would not comply with this, but without being out there, I can't say for sure.
Would this have to do with streetlights too, or no?
Streetlights are exempt.
Because
well, they're angled the right way at
you look
least.
down the streets, I mean, there's yellow and whites, I mean, there's lots of things. I mean,
Yeah.
so I just,
Well, even some complaints regarding LEDs and
Yes.
shining in places where they didn't previously when we had the old high-pressure sodiums.
And that's where the color,
right.
that same intensity might have been acceptable to those folks. But for lighting design, the color of the light really comes into play in properly designing even streetlights. And so it's certainly something that we need to be cognizant of.
And I think with a little bit of practice, this is not something that's difficult to tell. This is something that's pretty easy to tell. Once you get this in place, once you have an inspection department with the meter in hand, it's you walk out on the site and you go, yeah, that's
I was just
bad.
thinking about
That's not
120
good.
even.
Yeah,
I don't know if I need a meter. If I'm walking on the road and I get a spotlight like I'm in Hollywood, it's probably too much.
Right, exactly. It's
When I'm half a block away.
so this is something it'll get to be easier to understand just as soon
Yeah, I'll
as you
call
start.
my older person and maybe.
In terms of how this is actually, handled with the planning commission, this is going to be something part of the site plan review. And essentially, a civil engineer, they identify the kinds of lights they're going to be mounting height, and they actually put it on the buildings, and then they run a program, and it spits out a photometric plan that shows the foot candles at the property boundary line, and either it complies or it doesn't. If it doesn't comply, they modify the height, they might modify the lumens, and they get it to work. So I mean, it's going to be a pretty simple administrative task at the planning commission level. It's going to comply or not.
And we're kind of joking about it, but, with some of the things we want to do downtown, this and that, we probably want some later, brighter lights and stuff, different things. I mean, some of the things we've been talking about. So. But streetlights, it doesn't matter, but we don't just want streetlights either.
Yeah, with the lighting plan we have.
Okay. Okay, we're after 6 o'clock, and just a couple more minutes if we can do that. Okay?
Yeah, you got the floor.
Okay, I just don't want to overpass our
Does anybody got to take a break or anything?
I was planning until 9:30.
Your beard will be 2 inches longer, Thad, when we're done.
Okay, pressing onward. So basically, whenever you have a zoning code, okay, staff gets questions, planning commission members get questions, and they boil down into 2 different categories, right? Where can I put my business, or what can I do with my property? A lot of the questions just boil down to those 2 pots, so to speak. To understand how you answer those questions, maybe you can open up your documents if you have a paper copy and turn to Appendix A. And just by running through this, I think this might make a whole lot more sense. So what we have is, as part of the appendix, is a land use matrix. On the left-hand side is a listing of all the different kind of land uses. Okay, they're grouped into different categories for ease of finding things. And then on the right-hand side is the part of the table that shows all the zoning districts across the top. And then there are Ps and Cs that identify if that particular use is allowed by right, a P, within a given zoning district, or if it's a C, then it's a conditional use within that zoning district. Okay? So, in answering the question, what can I do with my property, or where can I put my business, essentially will dictate if you go down the column or across the row. Okay? What can I do with my property? You're going down the column. You're finding the zoning district where the property is located, and you're picking out all the different kind of land uses that are allowed either by right, a P, or as a conditional use, a C. Okay? The other question is, what can I do with my, or where can I put my business? You find the land use in that list, and then you go across the row, and you identify the zoning districts where that use can be located, either by right, a P, or conditional use, a C. Okay? So you can tell a lot just with that simple land use matrix. Any questions about that? Then the other part of the equation, so to speak, is found in Appendix B. And that is where we have a comprehensive list of all the different kind of land uses. Again, grouped into the categories that we had in the land use matrix. And then there is a definition of that land use. And we just have an example here. So there's always a definition for a given land use. There might be a photo. And then we have specific parking requirements associated with that land use. And then there may or may not be one or more supplemental standards specifically related to that land use. Okay? An example might be a bed and breakfast. There are supplemental standards in terms of the number of rooms that are allowed, the length of stay, and those kinds of things that apply specifically to that land use. Okay? Does that kind of make sense?
Do you have standards in relationship to treatment centers within a certain square mile? I mean, in my particular district, there's like 3 treatment centers within actually a few blocks, but within, let's say, a few square miles. Do you have that up there? So that if someone wants to put another one in that area, that won't be allowed?
You're gonna have to.
He's talking specifically about like an adult family home or a community-based residential facility.
Okay.
Otherwise, that whole community starts to change somewhat.
Right. And if you recall back to one of the slides that we had talked about, states saying you have to do or allow these kind of different land uses.
Mm-hmm.
Adult family homes and community living arrangements like that is one of those things that the state has called out and said, you need to allow these. But you can regulate them in certain ways. Okay? So with regard to that particular instance, again, what we're doing is mirroring what's already in state statutes. But yeah, I mean, that's an example of a supplemental standard.
I think the specific question though is in a case like that, can you control the density?
Yeah, right.
Within a given location?
Right.
Within a,
Given area.
Given area, can you limit the density of certain types of development? So, if someone's got a business plan and thinks that they can put 8 gas stations on a single block, can the city limit that through zoning? Say, no, you can't.
As a general answer, yes, you can do that.
Okay.
As long as it's not preempted by state statutes. Some communities say gas stations do not belong on intersections like this. You can do that.
I would say more than 10 CBRFs in 4 square blocks.
Right, but that comes back again to state statutes, a lot of that's preempted.
Okay.
But there is a provision in state statutes that says if the percentage of residents in a given area exceeds a certain percentage, then you can have the ability to prevent other ones. Okay? And there's a specific section in here that talks about that.
Yeah, that's what I was interested in.
Okay, and that, I can find it later and tell you what that is. It's in Article 8, I believe. Okay. Onward, again, we're answering.
Just really briefly on this too, what this does is it really helps the user to do a web search. So if they're looking for a specific land use or you know, of those two questions, there's the ability to, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit, but there's an ability for them to do a quick search that really helps them to find it and hopefully minimizes your staff time explaining things if they can find it and understand it.
So the other part of the equation is the dimensional standards that follow the zoning district. Okay, for every zoning district, you've got different minimum lot sizes, you've got different setbacks and offsets. So here is a table, and you can't see that, but obviously with Appendix C, we have 1 page for each of the zoning districts. Again, we're talking about dimensional things. And depending on the zoning district, you know, there might be some things that are in other zoning districts. Case in point would be impervious surface standards or building coverage. You would, you know, typically find that in a commercial district, but you wouldn't have that in a residential district. So what this allows staff to do is if somebody comes to the counter, they have the question, they can copy that part of the matrix where the information is, they can copy that part of Appendix B with that particular land use, and then they can copy the corresponding zoning district. So within those 3 sheets of paper, they have you know, a very good, you know, start understanding what can and can't happen on a piece of property. Okay. The other thing that we talked about previously, again, is building types. So this would be the 4th piece of paper that potentially could be copied and handed to a developer. So Appendix A, B, C is always the starting point. Everything else is the details, but those answer the basic questions. Kind of talked about this real briefly, but essentially as part of the overall project, we're going to be creating or have a website that will essentially have an interactive zoning map. So people can click on a zoning district, they can click on a parcel, and they can basically pull out the information from those appendices with a matter of clicks. Okay, so that's going to be online. It's going to be, you know, totally functional when we have the open house scheduled, so that people, as part of the open house, they can go to the website, they can find their property, and they can see how their property is going to be zoned, number 1, and what it means in terms of what land uses are allowed. Okay, it's going to be very, you know, user-friendly. People can go here instead of calling Adam or talking to Plan Commission members or anybody else.
No one wants to talk to me, so that's fine.
The other thing that we you know, haven't talked about specifically yet, but as part of the overall zoning project, we are also updating a portion of your existing comprehensive plan.
Yeah, that's agenda item 3. So.
Right, we're kind of blending everything together. It's essentially the future land use map is basically the overall vision of how the community is going to be developing over a 20-year period of time. And the zoning map is the actual details that implements the future land use map. So we had to circle back to the comprehensive plan and specifically the future land use map because the map that you have is kind of incomplete. There's errors in it. So as part of the overall project, we're updating this map as well. So you'll be seeing two different things. One is the comp plan update, and then the zoning code adoption. They kind of have to work in tandem, only because, again, the zoning map has to reflect what's on the future land use map.
And as you can tell, there's the corporate limits and those that are bordering our corporate
Yeah.
limits too, just to kind of give a picture too, that it's a 20-year snapshot of what could be.
Right. So what's left to do? Based on our discussion here, we'll probably have one or two more meetings with the Planning Commission to, take care of those unresolved issues. And then we'll take that content, upload it into the interactive zoning code, schedule the open house, which is kind of an informal, session, probably 5 or 6 hours, probably afternoon into the evening, where people can kind of come and go, get the information that they're looking for. And we hope to do a lot of the taking care of the issues in terms of the questions that people have. But there has to be a formal public hearing, and that's where people can provide, input one way or the other. And then based on that input, then, there might be some changes, revisions, and then there's a formal action by the Common Council. So that's what has to be done yet. We're coming down into the home stretch now. So you're going to be seeing, some of these things sooner rather than later. Okay. The other part of the project that we did is basically, we recognize that A Street is a major concern in terms of the development pattern. So we put together a relatively short report, but it talks about the existing conditions and then some examples of what can be done to A Street to kind of retrofit it to make it more appealing to both pedestrians and businesses. And this is something that we just threw into the project. It wasn't part of our scope. We just did it, knowing that A Street was a common theme throughout the entire project, and you can only do so much in zoning. And so this is really intended to looking at some things that you can do on an incremental basis over a period of time. You're not going to fix it overnight, but there are some things that you can do over a period of time. You just have to have that long-term commitment, that long-term vision. And the intent here is to say, this is what has been done elsewhere, and it could be done here. So, we talked mostly about zoning code, a little bit about the comp plan. Is there any comments, questions about either one of those things?
I would just note that, there's a lot there. But when looking at things like landscaping, lighting, parking requirements, bulk standards, there's a wide variety of where you can go on that spectrum. You can go to where we are currently, which is basically we don't have those regulations, or you can go to a Madison or a suburb of Madison type of thing where you have very extensive, very restrictive regulations. And through this process, I think the Planning Commission has done an excellent job of realizing where we are today and maybe where we want to be long-term, but what's practical for this first major step on the adoption of the code. So for example, on landscaping, not going to the most extreme example, but kind of trying to find a happy medium that people can kind of get used to and see what quality development looks like so that they understand it, rather than jumping all the way to maybe where you want to be in 10 years or 20 years, trying to kind of get people acclimated to it. Same thing with lighting, just really trying to get that in place. So I'm not saying that you're not going to hear concerns from the business community, for example, because it is a change. It is more restrictive than it is currently. Right now, if you want to pave every square inch of your lot, you can. I don't recommend it, but you can. And under that new code, you're going to have trees. You're going to have landscaping. It clarifies when hard surface is required, all those type of things. But like I said, I personally have been impressed with the Planning Commission, realizing that we want to be business friendly, but still improve the community. And I guess we'll see where it pans out, but if you have any specific questions on how those regulations are there, obviously you can contact me, or if you have specific questions on any of the other sections as you review it further, by all means, I'm happy to sit down and go through things with you. And if I don't know it, I know someone who
just add from a community character standpoint that there is some, some neighborhoods, there's a desire to have kind of a protectionalist layer of Third Street, for example, around the museum. There's some thought that that area should have different zoning or maybe more restrictive ability for people to preserve the neighborhood character. We didn't go there with this code. We really left that undone. So I think in terms of historic preservation or some of that kind of stuff, we didn't wade into that too deeply, and not that we didn't necessarily want to or didn't. It's probably more so we wanted to really encompass what was going to cover the entire city with a broad brush, and I believe that the zoning code does. And I think it does go a long way from a community character standpoint, that it's a lot more user friendly. There's the graphics that you talked about and some of those pieces. So I mean, overall, I think for 2 years of work, I mean, pretty proud of where it is. It's not going to be a silver bullet. It's not going to be an overnight thing. But I think for all of us that were involved in this, to set the tone of development for the next 20 years, it's kind of exciting.
Kind of brought, well, part 4 was adoption process and that, or agenda item 4, but the timing, so a couple more meetings with the planning commission, public hearing. I mean, are we talking a month, 2 months, half a year?
I think the goal is to get it done as quickly as possible, and not to say not to say that we're going to just ram it through, but I think we've been talking about this for long enough. Potentially scheduling the open house in late February, and depending on the input that we get from that, circling back, making changes at the planning commission level, recommendation to common council, public hearing, and then you decide.
I'd like to give my accolades to the planning commission. I'll tell you that. I know it was a big process.
A lot of extra.
And I only made a couple meetings, so I know it was.
I didn't keep count, but it was 17.
It was 17
or 18, right?
Yep. It's more than we anticipated. I know it's more than what we all thought going into it, but rather than presenting a half-baked proposal, we just took the time, did the meetings, and talked about basically every section, every sentence, every provision, to the best of everybody's ability.
Sometimes more than we'd like to.
It's gonna be a little more interactive, which is nice. You can get online and.
Yep.
Sure.
The planning commission did spend quite a bit of time on Appendix A. That's that land use matrix.
Yeah, I like that.
I would suggest that if there's something that you have time to focus on, I mean, ideally read everything, but if you can focus on something, it would be really taking a look through that land use matrix, and you can see, because there was a lot of discussion and a lot of input and guidance provided by the commission on what's permitted versus what's conditional where, and where something may not be allowed. So just as reassurance to the commission and the staff that worked on that, I would certainly appreciate and think that would be an area just to focus and spend some time reviewing that.
No, good point. I'll tell them
Along those lines, when the planning commission worked on that, that was before the new state legislation about the conditional uses and the burden of, or basically, saying that if somebody proposes a conditional use, you have to have very good documented reasons why you're not going to approve it. So perhaps that discussion can happen at the plan commission level to say, based on that new legislation, do you want to perhaps make some tweaks to that table, because here again, it's something that's brand new.
That's a good point.
So.
Anybody else got anything?
My only side comment is when I go and put my professional engineering hat on, as an engineer, I did site plans down in southern Wisconsin, Madison area for many years, and this is a really great tool for people who are doing development, and it makes it very easy and user-friendly compared to a lot of municipalities in which I did work. And it was very hard to scour through their stuff online, if it was even online, to get this information. So I'm happy to see this in our community and the effort that is going to be user-friendly for development.
No, I'd like to personally thank you guys. Great job, and planning commission, and actually actually the committee for getting together tonight too on short notice, so.
Someone said that there was a electronic copy.
There, yeah, we got an email
I
from
emailed it
Pat.
all to all.
And then you can have a hard,
Word night.
and they're monitoring it for reading that electronic.
This one.
I can send it to
I read it
somebody.
before.
You can do that, you know. Does anybody else got anything?
Here's the other internal thing we talked about, not to prolong this any further, but, you know, we have our Board of Zoning Appeals, and we have the council, and we have our commission that reviews these types of things, and since so much has been invested in it, my fear is that exceptions and kind of the hot button issues sometimes can emotionally rattle all of us, that, you know, we should honor this, and I think, you know, I'm gonna strongly suggest the same to our Board of Zoning Appeals, and ultimately they have the power, but I know the city attorney and I have talked about that there's a big investment by the taxpayers, obviously, in this code too. It wasn't just all the time, it was a substantial investment, so, you know, it's the new standard, and I hope that it remains to be as we've invested that much.
Anybody else? Now I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
A motion and a second, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, motion carried, adjourned at 6:30 PM.